Hey everyone, welcome into tonight's Fireside Chat, where tonight's topic is going to be on the beginning of the Civil War in American history, and we certainly have built up a lot of momentum to get to where we are here. So I really want to nail down a couple key points with you all. The first is just a reminder of what we covered today in class, which is that really the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 is no doubt what pushes the South over the edge. 7 states would break away from the Union following Lincoln's election in 1860. And again, this all comes back to this fear, this misguided fear, because again, as we mentioned, Lincoln was did not have any plans to eradicate slavery or abolish slavery, but Lincoln was a Northerner. His House divided speech put a lot of fear into many Southerners, and that's what prompted South Carolina and the ensuing 6 more states to break away from the Union in 1860. And the remaining states that would break away, the remaining 4 states would break away following the first shots of the Civil War, which were fired on April 12th in 1861 at the Battle of Fort Sumter, S-U-M-T-E-R, Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was the first shots of the Civil War. Nobody died in this battle. It was simply the Confederates bombed a Union fort in South Carolina. 1 horse was killed, sadly. But there were no casualties as far as the either American soldiers were concerned. And these were like the first official shots of the Civil War, and that meant, now we're bracing for a conflict that's only going to be resolved through weapons and through fighting. And the reality is, as we've built this whole entire sequence up to the point where we're at the point where the sectionalism crisis has been ongoing. What I really wanted to do was break down the advantages and disadvantages of both the North and the South, because this is really a key point in terms of you guys being able to understand. All right, so we're at the war. We know there's going to be a war. Let's really break down the advantages and disadvantages of each side. And I'll be giving you some tangible information as we go that kind of gives you an idea as to, what each side was in good position for and what each side was not in good position for. And I'm going to mix things up and actually use a whiteboard. So I hope you guys find this to be pretty advantageous for your understanding of the topic. So what we're going to do is go through kind of the advantages and disadvantages of each side. And I'm going to start with the North, which is also sometimes called the Union, or just, United States. So I want to start with the North, and I want to look at the Union. And we'll go disadvantages to advantages here. So I'll have to keep my face out of the way. This is a new experiment here. So let's go with disadvantages here. First of all, the majority of the battles in the Civil War are going to be fought in the South. And so the North was always fighting as sort of an invading army. And that obviously comes with certain disadvantages. You have to bring all your resources, supplies, and men into a foreign territory. Now Lincoln, this is kind of quite interesting. Lincoln never considered the South to be a foreign country. He refused to recognize the South as a foreign country. He refused to acknowledge the Confederacy as an independent country throughout the entire war. A very interesting thing about Lincoln. But no matter what, the North was going to be going into the South and fighting most of the battles on Southern ground. Another disadvantage of the North was military leadership. The North definitely was on the short end of good generals. The majority of the best generals in the war fought in the South. Another factor, though, is overconfidence. The North really came into the war thinking it was going to be a quick one. They didn't actually take the South's resolve to be serious. In fact, at the first Battle of Bull Run, that's one of the first big battles of the entire war, the Battle of Bull Run, there was such an ambivalence towards the war that people showed up and picnicked, yes, you heard that correct, picnicked on a hill, on a bluff, overlooking the Virginia battlefield. The North genuinely had this idea it was going to be a quick, easy war, and it was soon to obviously prove otherwise. Now, the advantage of the North, let's start with industry. The North was a factory-based economy, and that's crucial, going back to the market revolution. Think about how that all ties things together here. The North, being a factory-based economy, had the best abilities to produce weapons, ammunition, and what other war-making, cannons, whatever other war-making capabilities. The North had that distinctive advantage. Along the same lines, railroads. Now, we haven't talked a lot about railroads, but railroads were becoming increasingly important. Starting towards the late 1840s, early 1850s, railroads were becoming more and more prominent in America. The North had the majority of railroad lines, and that would be pivotal for getting troops to where they need to be in the battlefield. And speaking of troops, the North had a considerable size advantage over the South. Many more men in the North to fight, and in a war, that's sometimes what it comes down to. How about the fact that the North had an established government? You know, it was already the United States of America. There was already a Supreme Court, a legislature, executive branch, post office, those types of things. The South, meanwhile, had to start from scratch. More on that later. So that was a huge advantage for the North, to have all their government set up as they were. Now, Lincoln is, of course, another advantage for the North, and Lincoln's leadership, as we'll see throughout, was really paramount to the success of the North. We'll be looking at some of the things Lincoln did tomorrow more closely, some of the crucial decisions that he made in steering the United States towards victory. But Lincoln, as Commander-in-Chief, is going to prove to be a vital part of the success story involving the North. And to sort of tease that is what I have right below Lincoln. That's the border states. I'll be going more into the border states tomorrow, because that was one of the key decisions Lincoln made early in the war to help give the United States an advantage over the Confederacy. Now, speaking of the Confederacy, when the southern states broke away from the North, they began the process of having to start a brand new government from scratch. The Confederate States of America, the CSA, were formed in 1861, and they had an entire government started from scratch. They elected a president, Jefferson Davis. They elected a vice president, Alexander Stephens. They had a Supreme Court. They had a Congress. They had to make a post office. They had to make everything from scratch. They had to print money. The South was completely cut off from the North as far as the government was concerned. And that's one of the South's biggest disadvantages. You have a brand new government. You're starting from scratch. You have to make something up on your own while fighting a war. So certainly this led to the South having to scramble. And its government, which its capital city was in Richmond, that was not the first place. They eventually moved the capital to Richmond, Virginia. This new government, though, the Confederate States of America, had to do everything on its own without any help from the United States, the Union. They were totally cut off. And one of the South's biggest requests was that they wanted the Union and Lincoln to recognize their sovereignty. Lincoln refused to ever do that. He never officially called the South a foreign country. Another distinctive disadvantage of the South was the lack of industrial resources. The South was an agricultural-based economy, and that may be all well and good for the majority of things during peacetime, but not during wartime. The South would have to rely heavily on foreign imports to help fight their war, and they were constantly at a disadvantage when it comes to resources. And speaking of resources, if you're going to win a war, arguably the most important resource of all is money. Money. The South was short on money, and it would have to generate revenue the old-fashioned way, which we always talk about, which is to bump up taxes. And we'll be talking more about these issues tomorrow in class. But some of the advantages for the South was their leadership. They had the best generals. They had the better fighters, and this was evident right from the start, right from the get-go. I mentioned that battle of the first Bull Run, where people were picnicking because they thought this was going to be some leisurely activity. Well, Robert E. Lee, who was the general, the commander of the Confederate Army, and some of his colleagues, like Stonewall Jackson, there's a name that is just a great story. He was, him and his men formed a stone wall-like position at the Battle of First Bull Run. The North could not break through, and the South just would go on to prove that they had the better generals. And that's really what it came down to. Stonewall Jackson, that's where he got his nickname. His real name was Thomas. But he got the nickname Stonewall because his men held like a stone wall. And throughout the war, the Southern leadership was by far more so than the North. Another great advantage that the South had was the home field advantage. It was fighting on their turf. We talked about that with the American Revolution, how important that was for the United States against the British. Well, the same can be said about the Civil War. The Confederates were fighting on their home field. It was their homes, their turf to defend. They fought with more of a ferocity than perhaps the Union, who were the invading army. There may be more that I can go into, but I'm trying to keep the list manageable, and I hope you guys were able to get all that down. What I want to really focus on tomorrow, though, are the decisions and some of the policies by each government. You know, both would have to direct and steer the war effort to make sure it could win. And we're going to really focus on Lincoln, some of the decisions that he made, while looking at some of the issues that came up during the war. But this is not going to be a heavy military history. So if you want to talk about the battles, you want to talk about all that, you can come to my office hours on Wednesday. It's right there over my shoulder. Wednesday, 3 o'clock to 4:30. We can nerd out on Civil War battles. All right, everybody. That's about it for tonight. Hope you guys enjoyed the new trick with the whiteboards. Hope that helped you guys see things a little better. As always, you know the past shapes the future. Take care, everyone. Have a great night.